April 13th, 1945. Just past midnight. Harry Truman, president for less than 24 hours, sits alone in the Oval Office. On the desk in front of him, a folder. Unmarked, confidential. Someone handed it to him earlier that evening. One of Roosevelt's aides. Said he should read it when he had time. So now, after the longest day of his life, Truman opens it. Inside, evaluations, personnel assessments, internal memorandums, written by Roosevelt's closest advisors during the 1944 convention. About him. He starts reading. The first page, then the second, then the third. His hands stop moving. Because what he's reading isn't policy analysis. It's character assassination. Lacks foreign policy experience. Doesn't understand the complexities of post-war planning. Not prepared for the responsibilities of the presidency. Should be removed from the ticket. Page after page. The same message. Half of Roosevelt's inner circle, the people now working for him, had recommended he be replaced. Not after Roosevelt died. Before. While FDR was still alive, his own team was trying to get rid of the vice president. The man who would inherit the presidency. Truman closes the folder, sits back in Roosevelt's chair, and realizes something that changes everything. He's surrounded by people who never wanted him here. People who think he's not qualified. People who are waiting right now for him to fail. To understand what Truman found in that folder, you have to go back. Back to July 1944. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Franklin Roosevelt is running for a fourth term. The man has been president for 11 years. Led America through the Great Depression, through most of World War II. But he's dying. Everyone close to him can see it. The gray skin, the trembling hands, the exhaustion. His doctors know he probably won't survive another term. Which means the vice president isn't just a ceremonial position anymore. Whoever gets that job will likely become president of the United States. And that's where the trouble begins. Roosevelt's inner circle is deeply divided over who that should be. On one side, the progressives, the New Dealers, the labor unions. They want Henry Wallace to stay on as vice president. Wallace is Roosevelt's man, a true believer in the New Deal. Pro-labor, pro-Soviet cooperation. The left wing of the party loves him, but the party bosses despise him. They think Wallace is too radical, too naive about Stalin, too unpredictable. Southern Democrats won't support him. Business interests won't support him. So the bosses push for someone else. Someone safe, someone moderate, someone who won't rock the boat. They settle on Harry Truman, senator from Missouri, 60 years old, known for his work investigating waste in military spending during the war. But that's about all he's known for. He's not a national figure, not a Roosevelt insider, not anyone's first choice, really. He's just acceptable. To the South, to the labor unions, to the moderates, he won't excite anyone. But he won't offend anyone either. Roosevelt doesn't fight for Wallace, doesn't fight for anyone. He tells the party bosses, clear it with them. I don't care who it is. That's how Harry Truman becomes vice president of the United States. Not because Franklin Roosevelt chose him, because Franklin Roosevelt didn't choose. Truman accepts the nomination. He campaigns across the country. Roosevelt wins in November. And then, nothing. Roosevelt shuts Truman out, completely. For the next 82 days, Harry Truman serves as vice president. In those 82 days, he meets privately with President Roosevelt exactly twice. 2 meetings, in nearly 3 months. He's not invited to cabinet meetings, not briefed on military strategy, not consulted on diplomatic negotiations. He doesn't know about the Manhattan Project, the secret program building an atomic bomb. He doesn't know about the Yalta Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin divided up post-war Europe. He doesn't know about Roosevelt's private commitments to Stalin about Poland, about Germany, about the Far East. Truman spends his time presiding over the Senate, attending state funerals, giving ceremonial speeches at war bond rallies. He's a figurehead, and everyone in Washington knows it. Then, on April 12, 1945, everything changes. Truman is having a drink with some senators in the Capitol building when he gets an urgent message. Come to the White House immediately. He rushes over, still doesn't know what's happening. Eleanor Roosevelt is waiting for him in the family quarters. She puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman is stunned, can barely speak. He finally says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Eleanor looks at him. She's grieving, exhausted. And she says something Truman will never forget. "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." 2 hours later, Harry Truman takes the oath of office. He's President of the United States. But he inherits more than just the office. He inherits Roosevelt's government, Roosevelt's cabinet, Roosevelt's staff, Roosevelt's war, Roosevelt's alliances, Roosevelt's commitments, and Roosevelt's people, almost none of whom wanted him there in the first place. Here's what Truman walked into. Franklin Roosevelt had been president for 12 years. In that time, he'd built something unprecedented in American history. Not just an administration, a system. Personal advisors who reported only to him. Agencies that answered only to him. Secret channels of communication with Churchill, with Stalin, with military commanders around the world. Roosevelt ran the government like his own private operation. Everything flowed through him. And when he died, that system didn't disappear. It just kept running, without Truman. Let's be clear about what this meant. In Roosevelt's final year, he held hundreds of private meetings with his inner circle. Truman wasn't invited to a single one. Roosevelt sent secret cables to Churchill and Stalin almost daily. Truman never saw them. Roosevelt made commitments at Yalta about Poland, about Germany, about the United Nations, that would shape the world for the next 50 years. Truman read about them in the newspaper. Now imagine being Harry Truman in that first week as president. You're responsible for ending the war in Europe, managing the alliance with the Soviet Union, deciding what to do about Japan, the most consequential decisions in modern history. And you don't know what agreements Roosevelt made. You don't know what Roosevelt promised. You don't know who Roosevelt trusted. You don't even know what's in the files. So Truman starts asking questions. He calls meetings, requests briefings, demands to see documents. And that's when he begins to understand the real problem. The people around him aren't just withholding information. They're evaluating him, measuring him, waiting to see if he's up to the job. Look at who surrounds him. Henry Wallace, the man Truman replaced as vice president, is still in the cabinet as Secretary of Commerce. Wallace has allies throughout the government. People who think he should have stayed on as VP. People who see Truman as a political hack who stole Wallace's job. Then there's the State Department. Career diplomats who spent years crafting Roosevelt's foreign policy. Men who negotiated with Churchill and Stalin. Who understand the complexity of post-war planning. They look at Truman and see a former county judge from Missouri. What could he possibly know about running the world? Then there's the military establishment. Generals like George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower, admirals who planned the Pacific Campaign. These men had direct access to Roosevelt, could walk into the Oval Office any time. Now they have to go through Truman, a man who was never a general, never commanded troops, never even saw combat. Then there's J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement official in America. Hoover survived in Washington by collecting information, knowing secrets, having leverage over everyone. He had Roosevelt's ear for years. Now he's watching Truman, carefully, waiting to see what kind of president this man will be. So Truman does what any new leader would do. He starts reading files, going through Roosevelt's papers, State Department cables, military reports, intelligence assessments, trying to piece together what he's inherited. And then, probably late April, maybe early May, someone hands him that folder, the one with the evaluations from the 1944 convention. He opens it, and he starts to read. Senator Truman lacks the depth of knowledge required for the vice presidency. His foreign policy experience is negligible. He has not demonstrated an understanding of the post-war challenges facing the nation. Recommendation: the president should select a different running mate. Another memo: if Senator Truman remains on the ticket, we risk placing an unprepared man one heartbeat away from the presidency. Another: in the event of the president's death, Senator Truman would be unable to maintain continuity of policy or leadership. Page after page, assessment after assessment, all saying the same thing: Harry Truman isn't qualified. Harry Truman isn't ready. Harry Truman should be removed. These aren't assessments from Republicans trying to undermine Roosevelt. These are internal memos from Roosevelt's own people. The people now working for him. Half of Roosevelt's inner circle had argued, behind closed doors, in private meetings, that Harry Truman should be taken off the ticket. Even after the convention, even after he'd been nominated, they wanted him gone, and Roosevelt knew. Roosevelt read these assessments and kept Truman anyway. Not because he disagreed with them, but because Truman was politically convenient. Truman closes the folder. He sits there in the Oval Office, alone, past midnight, the weight of what he's just read settling over him. Because this isn't simply criticism. This is something worse. Sitting there, Truman understands what's really happening. Roosevelt never trusted him, never saw him as a partner, never believed he had the intelligence or the experience to do this job. Roosevelt chose him because he was acceptable, safe, forgettable, someone the party bosses could live with, a placeholder, someone to fill the slot on the ticket without causing problems. Roosevelt never prepared him because Roosevelt never thought preparation mattered. Because Roosevelt never believed Truman would actually become president. Even though the doctors said Roosevelt was dying, even though everyone could see his health failing, Roosevelt assumed he'd make it through the term. And if he didn't, well, they'd deal with that problem when it happened. But now that problem is here, and Truman is surrounded by Roosevelt's people. People who still believe what they wrote in those memos. People who smile and say, "Yes, Mr. President," during the day, and wonder at night if the country made a terrible mistake. Because if Truman fails, it proves they were right all along, that he wasn't qualified, that he never should have been here. That's the trap Truman is in. He can't fire everyone. He needs these people. They know how the government works. They have relationships with Churchill, with Stalin, with Congress. But he can't fully trust them either, because he doesn't know who wrote those memos. He doesn't know who's still loyal to Roosevelt's vision and who's loyal to him. He doesn't know who's feeding information to Henry Wallace's supporters, or to journalists, or to foreign governments. Roosevelt had 12 years to build loyalty, to build trust, to know who his people were. Truman has none of that. He's an outsider. In his own administration, think about what that means. You're President of the United States, the most powerful position in the world. You're making decisions about ending a world war, about the atomic bomb, about the future of Europe. And you can't trust the people advising you, because they never wanted you in the first place. That's what Truman realized that night. And it changed everything. After that night, Truman made a decision. He wasn't going to be Roosevelt's shadow. He wasn't going to spend 4 years trying to prove himself to people who'd already decided he wasn't good enough. He was going to be president, his kind of president. And that meant cleaning house. Over the next 6 months, Truman quietly rebuilt the entire government. It wasn't dramatic. No public fights, no newspaper headlines about mass firings, just, methodically, a complete takeover. By August 1945, half the cabinet was gone. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, one of Roosevelt's closest advisors, replaced by James Burns, a man Truman actually trusted. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, another Roosevelt loyalist, pushed out. Replaced by Fred Vinson. Attorney General Francis Biddle, gone. By January 1946, most of Roosevelt's inner circle had been moved out. Not fired. That would have caused too much controversy. But reassigned, retired, encouraged to pursue other opportunities. And Truman brought in his own people, friends from Missouri, men he'd worked with in the Senate, people who were loyal to him, not to Roosevelt's memory, his kind of people. Second, he changed how decisions were made. Roosevelt had run the government through personal relationships, private meetings, informal agreements. Truman formalized everything. He created the National Security Council, so military and diplomatic decisions went through a structured process. He reorganized the intelligence services, combining them into what would become the CIA. He made the cabinet meet regularly, made them report to him, made them accountable. No more secret deals, no more private channels that only Roosevelt knew about. If you wanted to shape policy, you went through official channels. Third, and this was the big one, Truman started making decisions that Roosevelt never would have made. The atomic bomb. Roosevelt's advisors were split on whether to use it. Some said yes, end the war quickly, save American lives. Others said no, it's too powerful, it'll horrify the world. It'll start an arms race with the Soviets. Truman listened to both sides. Then he made the call. Use it. Not because it's what Roosevelt would have done. Nobody knew what Roosevelt would have done. But because Truman believed it was right. Then, the Truman Doctrine. When Greece and Turkey were threatened by Soviet-backed communist insurgencies in 1947, Truman committed American military aid. Roosevelt probably would have tried to negotiate with Stalin, find some kind of accommodation. Truman drew a line, said, "No more expansion. This is where it stops." That doctrine, containment, became the foundation of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. Then, the Marshall Plan, sending billions of dollars to rebuild Europe, the largest foreign aid program in history. Roosevelt's old advisors said it was too expensive. too risky. Stalin would see it as a threat. Truman did it anyway. And finally, Henry Wallace. Wallace was still in the cabinet, still giving speeches, still publicly criticizing Truman's approach to the Soviet Union, calling for cooperation with Stalin, saying Truman was too aggressive, too confrontational, undermining the president in public. Truman tolerated it for 18 months. Then, in September 1946, after Wallace gave a speech attacking Truman's foreign policy, Truman called him into the Oval Office. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. Wallace was fired, just like that. No negotiation, no second chances. You can't have a cabinet member working against you, not even Roosevelt's former vice president. Wallace's supporters were furious, called Truman a dictator, said he was betraying Roosevelt's legacy. Truman didn't care. He'd learned his lesson that night with the folder. You can't lead if you're trying to please everyone. You can't govern if half your team is waiting for you to fail. You have to make a choice. Be yourself, or be who they wanted. Truman chose himself. This story isn't just about Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt. It's about how power actually transfers in America. And the lesson is this: institutions don't follow people. They follow systems. Roosevelt built a system over 12 years, a way of governing, a network of relationships and processes and informal agreements. When he died, that system didn't disappear. It kept running, and it resisted anyone who tried to change it. That's what Truman faced. Not a conspiracy, not some plot to overthrow him, just institutional inertia. People doing things the way they'd always done them, protecting relationships they'd spent years building, defending policies they'd helped create, and seeing the new guy as a threat to all of that. Second lesson: loyalty outlasts usefulness. Half of Roosevelt's advisors didn't think Truman was qualified, but they didn't quit. They didn't resign in protest. They stayed, kept their positions, kept working. Why? Because that's how Washington operates. You don't leave just because you disagree with the boss. You stay, you wait, you hope things improve. And if they don't, if the new guy fails, well, that proves you were right all along. That's the danger of inherited power. The people around you aren't necessarily your people. They're the last guy's people. And you have to figure out who's actually loyal, who's just going through the motions, who's actively hoping you'll fail. That's an impossible calculation. And it almost broke Truman. Third lesson, and this is the most important one. The hardest thing about inheriting power is that you inherit someone else's commitments. Roosevelt made deals at Yalta that Truman never would have agreed to. Roosevelt made promises to Stalin that Truman thought were naive. Roosevelt built relationships based on trust that Truman didn't share. But now, Truman had to honor those commitments, or break them and deal with the consequences. Either way, he couldn't start fresh. He was trapped by decisions made before he even knew he'd be president. That's the reality of succession. You don't get a clean slate. You get someone else's mess. And then you're judged on how you handle it. Most people in Truman's position would have failed, would have tried to be Roosevelt, would have kept Roosevelt's people happy, would have avoided controversy, would have been paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. Truman didn't do that. He made mistakes, plenty of them, but he made them as himself, not as Roosevelt's shadow. And in the end, that's why he succeeded. Years later, after Truman left office, a reporter asked him about those first months as president. Truman smiled. That tight, thin smile he was known for. He said, "I didn't know if I was coming or going. Half the people around me thought I was an idiot. The other half were just waiting to see if I'd prove them right." He paused, took a sip of bourbon. The hardest thing wasn't making decisions. It was knowing who to listen to. Because everyone had advice, everyone had opinions, but not everyone wanted me to succeed. The reporter asked if he ever felt overwhelmed. Truman shook his head. "No. Because I learned something early on. You can spend your whole presidency trying to live up to someone else's expectations, or you can do what you think is right and let history judge you." He never mentioned the folder, never talked about those memos from 1944, never said who wrote them, but every major decision he made after that night was shaped by what he'd read. The atomic bomb, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, firing MacArthur, recognizing Israel, desegregating the military. Those weren't Roosevelt's policies. They were Truman's, because he'd learned something that night in the Oval Office, reading those evaluations by lamplight. You can inherit power, but you can't inherit respect. You have to earn it. And the only way to do that is to stop being who people expected you to be and start being who you actually are. Harry Truman did that, against incredible odds, against tremendous resistance. And in the end, he didn't just fill Roosevelt's shoes. He stepped out of them entirely, built his own legacy, made his own decisions, became his own kind of president. Not the president Roosevelt's people wanted, but the president America needed. And that folder, the one that documented all their doubts, all their objections, all their reasons why he wasn't good enough, that folder became the fuel for one of the most consequential presidencies in American history. Because sometimes, the best thing you can do with other people's low expectations is prove them wrong. April 30th, Notice Box V5. 3:18 p.m. Flensburg, northern Germany. The light in the room is gray. Not the gray of evening, but the gray of a world running out of color. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz sits at a desk that once belonged to a shipping merchant, surrounded by maps that no longer mean anything. The radio crackles. Static, then words. A message from Berlin, encrypted, brief. Hitler is dead. And Dönitz, the submariner, the tactician who spent the war beneath the waves, is now Führer of the Third Reich. He reads the telegram 3 times. Not because he doesn't understand it, but because understanding it changes everything. Outside, the town of Flensburg continues. Refugees shuffle through streets. Soldiers without orders lean against walls. The Reich, in its final days, has become a nation of waiting, waiting for orders, waiting for permission to stop, waiting for someone to tell them what comes next. Dönitz folds the paper. His hands do not shake. He has spent years commanding men in steel tubes beneath the Atlantic, where panic is death. He does not panic now, but he knows. He knows that what he has inherited is not power. It is the obligation to end something that has already ended. Let's go back 6 days. April 24th. The Führer bunker in Berlin is not a command center anymore. It's a tomb with electricity. Soviet artillery pounds the city above. In the map room, Hitler moves divisions that no longer exist. His hands tremble as he pushes pins across paper, repositioning ghost armies. Steiner will attack from the north, he says. Wenck will relieve Berlin from the southwest. Steiner's forces are scattered, undersupplied, outnumbered 10-1. Wenck's army is fighting just to stay intact. The men in the bunker know this, but no one speaks. Hitler's 56th birthday has just passed. There were no celebrations. Goebbels gave a speech on the radio about final victory through faith. Speer quietly began sabotaging scorched earth orders. Himmler, the architect of obedience, was already negotiating with the Allies through Swedish intermediaries, trying to broker a separate peace. The Reich is not collapsing. It has collapsed. What remains is a fiction sustained by silence. And then, on April 30th, Hitler ends that fiction himself. A gunshot in a bunker. Eva Braun beside him, cyanide on her lips. The bodies are carried up concrete steps, doused in gasoline, set aflame in a shell crater in the Chancellery Garden. By the time the remains are unrecognizable, the message has already been sent north. The Führer is dead. Dönitz is appointed President of the Reich and Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht. May 1st, 1945. Morning. Flensburg. Dönitz assembles what he calls a government. It is not a government. It is a collection of men in a seaside town, holding titles that no longer command anything. Albert Speer is there, Minister of Armaments for factories that have stopped producing. Alfred Jodl is there, Chief of Operations for operations that cannot be executed. Heinrich Himmler arrives, expecting to be kept in the inner circle, still believing his secret negotiations make him indispensable. Dönitz looks at him and says, "There is no position for you here." Himmler leaves. 2 weeks later, he will bite down on a cyanide capsule in British custody. But here, in this moment, his departure is just one more irrelevance in a cascade of irrelevances. Dönitz sits at the desk. He drafts a proclamation. It is read over the radio that evening. German men and women, soldiers of the Wehrmacht, our Führer, Adolf Hitler, has fallen. The German people bow in deepest mourning and reverence. He recognized the terrible danger of Bolshevism early and dedicated his life to the fight against it. His struggle has ended. I have been appointed by the Führer as his successor. Notice what he does not say. He does not say, "We will fight to the last man." He does not say, "Victory is near." He speaks in past tense, has fallen, has ended. Because Dönitz is not a Nazi ideologue. He is a naval officer. He understands command, discipline, logistics. And he understands something that Hitler never could. That will, without means, is not strategy. It is suicide. The question now is not can we win? The question is how do we stop? May 2nd. Dönitz sends emissaries to the Allies, not to negotiate terms. He knows intellectually that there will be no terms, but to negotiate time. Time to evacuate troops from the east. Time to move civilians out of Soviet-occupied zones. Time to execute what he calls partial surrenders in the West, while continuing to fight the Soviets. This is his plan. It is rational. It is tactical. It is completely impossible. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery receives the German delegation at his headquarters on Lüneburg Heath. The envoy is Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, Dönitz's subordinate. He sits across from Montgomery, a man who has spent 4 years outfighting Rommel, outmaneuvering German armor, outlasting the Wehrmacht across North Africa, Italy, France, and now into Germany itself. Friedeberg begins. "We wish to discuss terms." Montgomery cuts him off. "There are no terms. You will surrender unconditionally, all forces, all fronts, simultaneously." Friedeberg tries again. "We must consider the fate of German soldiers in the East." Not my concern. "Civilians fleeing Soviet advance. Not my concern." Montgomery leans forward. His voice is not angry. It is final. "You will surrender to all the Allies at once, or you will surrender to none. There is no German Reich left to negotiate with." Friedeberg returns to Flensburg. He delivers the message to Dönitz. And for the first time, the reality settles in, not as theory, not as possibility, but as fact. There is no government here. There is no state. The Allies do not recognize Dönitz as a president, because they do not recognize the Reich as a nation. What exists in Flensburg is not a capital. It is a waiting room for surrender. May 3rd, 4th. Dönitz keeps working. He cannot help it. It is what commanders do. He sends orders to Army Group Vistula. Disengage from Soviet forces and move west. He coordinates with Navy units in the Baltic. Evacuate as many refugees as possible to Schleswig-Holstein. Operation Hannibal, the largest sea evacuation in history, is still ongoing. U-boats and destroyers and fishing trawlers pulling soldiers and civilians out of Courland, out of East Prussia, out of the closing Soviet net. But the orders are not being followed. Not because of disobedience, but because the infrastructure to follow them no longer exists. Communications are severed. Fuel depots are empty. Units report their positions and then vanish, overrun or surrendered before new orders can arrive. In Italy, the German forces surrender en masse on May 2nd. In Berlin, the garrison capitulates the same day. In the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Norway, German commanders are already negotiating local surrenders with Allied officers. The Wehrmacht is dissolving, not through defeat in a final battle, but through the simple, irreversible exhaustion of the ability to continue. And Dönitz, in Flensburg, keeps sending orders. Because to stop sending orders is to admit that there is nothing left to command. May 4th, 1945. Evening. Friedeberg returns from another meeting with Montgomery. This time, he brings the final text. It is not a proposal, it is a demand. All German forces in Northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands will surrender unconditionally, effective immediately. Dönitz reads it. He looks at Jodl. Jodl looks back, and for a moment, neither man speaks. Then Dönitz says, "If we refuse?" Jodl answers, "They will resume the offensive. They will flatten every city still in our hands. And when we surrender after that, the terms will be worse." Dönitz knows Jodl is right. But signing this means signing away the illusion that he is still Führer of anything. It means admitting that Flensburg is not a government. It is a provisional holding area for a defeated command staff. He picks up the pen. He signs. And with that signature, the Reich ceases to be a belligerent power in Northwest Europe. It becomes a series of administrative zones, waiting for final dissolution. May 5th, 6th. But it is not over. Because there are still German forces fighting in Czechoslovakia, still forces in Norway, in the Baltic, in Austria. Dönitz is told by the Allies, "You will send representatives to Rams, to General Eisenhower's headquarters, and you will sign a comprehensive surrender for all German forces on all fronts simultaneously." Jodl is sent. He arrives in Reims on May 6th. He sits in a red brick schoolhouse that has been converted into Schaff headquarters. The room is plain, functional, maps on the walls, a long table. Eisenhower is not even present. He has delegated the formalities to his chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. Jodl asks, one last time, for a 48-hour delay, to allow more troops to move west, to avoid Soviet captivity. Smith's answer is immediate. No. Jodl sends a telegram back to Flensburg. They will accept nothing less than full, immediate, unconditional surrender on all fronts. Advise if I am authorized to sign. Dönitz receives the message. He sits in silence. He thinks about the millions of soldiers still in the field. He thinks about the civilians still fleeing. He thinks about the oath he swore, not to Hitler, but to Germany. And then he sends back the reply. Authorized. May 7th, 1945. 2:41 a.m. Reims, France. The room is crowded with officers, photographers, translators. Jodl sits at the table, flanked by Admiral Friedeberg. Across from them, General Smith, Soviet General Ivan Susloparov, French General François Sévez. The document is placed in front of Jodl. It is 5 pages, single-spaced, bureaucratic. It begins. The undersigned, acting by authority of the German High Command, hereby surrenders unconditionally to the Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command, all forces on land, sea, and in the air. Jodl reads it. He picks up the pen. He signs his name. Friedeberg signs. Smith signs. Susloparov signs. Sévez signs. The war in Europe is over. But Jodl, before he leaves the room, makes a statement for the record. His voice is steady, formal, drained of emotion. With this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the hands of the victors. In this war, which has lasted more than 5 years, both have achieved and suffered more than perhaps any other people in the world. It is not an apology. It is not a justification. It is an epitaph. May 8th, 1945. Flensburg. Donitz receives confirmation. The ceasefire is in effect. All German forces have been ordered to lay down arms. In Berlin, Soviet soldiers are raising the red flag over the Reichstag. In London, in New York, in Moscow, crowds pour into the streets. Victory in Europe. VE Day. In Flensburg, there are no crowds. Donitz sits at the desk. He drafts a final order of the day to the German armed forces. The Wehrmacht has been compelled to cease the hopeless struggle. The nearly 6-year heroic fight is over. Soldiers, I have confidence in you. Your task is to help our tormented people, so that it can endure the heavy times ahead. He does not say we were betrayed. He does not say we will rise again. He says, help the people endure. Because he knows. He has known since the moment he read Hitler's death telegram. Power without legitimacy is theater. Command without force is paperwork. And a government that exists only because no one has bothered to arrest it yet is not a government. It is a footnote. May 23rd, 1945. 9:47 a.m. Flensburg. British troops surround the Naval Academy where Donitz has set up his administration. Officers enter the building. Donitz is informed. You are under arrest. He does not resist. He removes his uniform insignia, hands over his sidearm, and is taken into custody. The Reich that he inherited for 23 days is formally dissolved. There is no ceremony. There is no final declaration. There is simply a man in a room, being escorted out by soldiers, while clerks pack up maps and files that no one will ever read. Speer is arrested the same day. Jodl a few days later. The entire Flensburg government is dismantled in less than an hour, because it was never a government. It was an intermission between the end of the war and the beginning of occupation. Donitz will spend 10 years in Spandau prison, convicted of war crimes. Not for the Holocaust, not for the invasions, but for waging unrestricted submarine warfare. When he is released in 1956, he will write memoirs defending his service, insisting he was a naval officer, not a politician. But he knows. He knew then, in that gray room in Flensburg, reading the telegram that made him Führer. He signed not a treaty, but an obituary. Think about that moment, May 1st, 1945. You inherit absolute power over a nation that no longer exists. You command armies that are surrendering without your orders. You govern territory that shrinks by the hour. You are Führer of a state that the world no longer recognizes as real. What do? Dönitz chose to manage the collapse, to minimize suffering where he could, to execute surrenders district by district, unit by unit, hoping to save lives in the process. History will argue whether he succeeded. But he made a choice that Hitler never could. He acknowledged reality. Because there are moments in history when power is revealed for what it always was. Not a force, but an agreement. And when the agreement ends, the power ends with it. You can hold a title. You can issue orders. You can sit at a desk in a room that used to matter. But if no one is listening, you are not a commander. You are a man, alone, in a silent room, writing words that no one will obey. The Reich did not fall in Berlin, in the rubble and the flames. It fell in Flensburg, in a quiet office by the sea. The moment Dönitz picked up a pen and signed his name to a surrender he could not refuse. Some men inherit kingdoms. Dönitz inherited an ending. And he carried it, with discipline and silence, to the only conclusion left.